The story begins with a church ceremony in which a priest touches a crystal ball and informs someone that their suitable profession is that of a soldier. The church officials kept calling teenagers forward one by one. Among them was Chris sparring, standing in line. Everyone whispered about him. He was the son of the famous sparring family. They wondered what profession he would receive. Hearing their high expectations, Chris grew anxious. He and the other teens were taking part in the ritual of heavenly grace. In the kingdom of Meldrake, all 16-year-olds went through this ritual to discover their suitable profession and the skills that came with it. The professions ranged from combat roles to non-combat jobs, with some rare and advanced ones appearing from time to time. Those who received a high-class profession were given special treatment, while those with lower-ranked jobs faced disappointment. Chris's father had always expected great things from him. For years, he had trained Chris, hoping he would receive a profession that would surpass his own. Chris could only hope that he wouldn't be humiliated in the ritual. The priest called Chris forward. He knelt and waited for the priest's announcement. The priest then declared that Chris was suited to be a farmer and had the skill poison resistance. Hearing this, Chris felt like his world had collapsed. People around him began whispering. Suddenly, a boy spoke loudly, questioning if Chris would really be a farmer. He patted Chris on the back and told him it was okay. The boy was Klaus, Chris's brother. Klaus then stepped forward when called. The crowd murmured about how kind he was for supporting his older brother. Despite Chris receiving the farmer profession, Chris looked down at his rough, trembling hands. He couldn't believe he had spent so many days working hard, only to fall short of his father's expectations. Everyone suddenly started talking about the person who had stepped forward and claimed the holy sword. The others found it intimidating. That person was Klaus, the fifth one to receive the holy sword since the first hero. The crowd cheered for Klaus, who stood in the spotlight, while Chris sat in silence, feeling down about his profession. Their father praised Klaus endlessly. As someone from the sparring family, he told Klaus to become a great leader in the future. Meanwhile, Chris had been ignored the entire time. When he finally called out to his father, he was met with a look of pure disgust. Shocked, Chris didn't know what to say. His father then started complaining about how he had trained Chris for years, only for him to end up with a farmer profession. He was furious that Chris dared to stand before him without showing any emotion. Chris apologized, but his father only grew harsher. He ordered Chris to leave the house, calling him useless. Afterward, Chris decided to take only one bag with the things he needed. The day before, he had been nothing more than a practice dummy, sparring with Klaus using only his bare hands. As he was leaving, Klaus noticed him walking out and asked why he was leaving without saying anything. Then, Klaus told him not to worry, saying he had protected the family's reputation for him. His expression looked cruel, completely different from the kind face he showed in public. Chris couldn't even respond. Klaus complained that he didn't even hear a thank you from his own brother. Chris then asked why he was making fun of him when they had never really spoken before. Since childhood, Klaus had been weak, always staying close to their mother and the family doctor. He slowly got better at the age of 5 and started living a normal life, unlike Chris, who had been training hard since he was little. Chris also knew Klaus didn't like him because he never answered whenever he spoke to him. Until now, they had never really had a proper conversation. Klaus suddenly laughed and asked if Chris really didn't understand. He said that he had been the one abandoned by their father all this time. He couldn't believe that someone born just 10 minutes before him was raised with love and care while he was not. Chris understood how Klaus felt, but he still wondered why his brother hated him so much. If anything, he was the one who had wanted things to change the most. While he spent his childhood covered in bruises from endless training, he could only watch with jealousy as their mother showed kindness only to Klaus. Klaus kept laughing, saying that God was on his side this time and had given him the holy sword. He couldn't believe his brother had become just a farmer. Annoyed, Chris told him to be quiet. At that moment, Klaus pointed his sword at Chris's face, warning him not to get angry or he might kill him. Chris quickly blocked the sword and got into a fighting stance. Klaus laughed again, amused that a simple farmer thought he could fight someone holding a holy sword. Calmly, he told Chris that he was ready. In a split second, Chris's sword was already just a centimeter from Klaus's neck. Klaus was too shocked to say anything. Without a word, Chris sheathed his sword back and walked off. In his mind, he knew the result would be the same even as a farmer because he had trained hard since childhood, unlike Klaus. Angry, Klaus shouted that the fight wasn't over yet, but Chris said it was already finished. He had no interest in weak opponents. His words enraged Klaus, who then decided to kill him. Chris suddenly felt an intense pressure and turned around. He saw Klaus glowing with divine power. Klaus declared that Chris would die and unleashed his holy sword skill, Sacred Slash. The hallway exploded. When the smoke cleared, Chris was sitting on the floor in sweat, but completely unharmed. Klaus couldn't believe he had missed. He realized he had used too much power. Chris was at a loss for words. In his mind, the sword skills he had worked so hard to master seemed useless. Against the strongest profession, the gap in power was undeniable. Later, someone stormed through the forest entrance, shouting in frustration. Klaus couldn't believe he had been fooled again. Angry, he yelled for Chris to come back and fight him. Meanwhile, deep in the dark and quiet forest, Chris stumbled forward, struggling to catch his breath. He kept moving past the trees until he reached a lake. Exhausted, he collapsed against a tree and took off his boot, revealing a large bruise on his right foot. He had barely escaped danger and now had to figure out what to do next. As he rested, he thought about Klaus's smug expression. He still couldn't believe his own twin had tried to kill him. If Klaus found him again, he knew he wouldn't survive. Fearing someone might be chasing him, Chris decided to stay hidden in the forest for now. He only had a little bit of jerky left. If he wasn't injured, he could have hunted for food, but in his condition, that wasn't possible. He unwrapped some bandages from his arm and used them on his injured foot instead. Despite the pain, Chris forced himself to keep walking. He looked around, his face filled with worry. This was Pasha Forest, the place where he used to train with his father. But he had never gone this deep before. Strangely, there were no signs of animals or monsters anywhere. Chris found a small opening at the base of a random cliff. It wasn't much, but it gave him a place to stay, safe from the wind and rain. For now, all he could do was wait. Just then, his stomach growled loudly. At the same moment, a bug crawled in front of him. He stared at it, knowing he might have to eat it as a last resort. Realizing he needed food, Chris left the cave. Outside, he only saw plants with buds that looked like faces. Since he had toxic resistance, he believed he wouldn't die no matter what he ate. He hadn't tested this ability yet, but he hoped it would work. He took a bite of the nearest plant. The leaves were surprisingly sweet, but the flower was so bitter and disgusting that his whole body trembled. Moving on, he found another plant with bell-shaped flowers. After tasting it, he realized it was nothing but bitter and dry. If he kept eating plants like these, he figured something strange might happen to him. Chris started looking around for food. He found some strange-looking mushrooms and fruits, along with a flycatcher. He ignored the flycatcher and gathered anything that seemed edible. But he had another problem, finding clean water to drink. The only water nearby was a muddy puddle. When he scooped some up, it slipped through his fingers in a disgusting way. He thought about returning to the lake he had seen earlier, but it was too far. And he had wandered so deep into the forest that he no longer knew the way back. Chris had toxic resistance, so he reached for the muddy water, believing it wouldn't harm him. He hesitated, worried about dehydration. After a moment of doubt, he brought the water to his mouth. It smelled awful and tasted bitter, an unfamiliar and unpleasant sensation. Almost immediately, he threw up everything he had swallowed. In the end, there was no clean water and no real food. That night, as Chris lay inside the cave, he remembered his last fight with Klaus. He pictured Klaus smirking before cutting him in half with the holy sword. Imagining such event kept Chris awake, so he got up. Chris spent his days in the forest trying to survive. He made a stone axe, stayed inside the cave when it rained, and picked up bugs whenever he found them. After a few days, he finally got some meat. It was just a dead animal he found in the forest, but it was the first one he had come across. The meat was a little rotten, but after eating only plants and bugs for days, it felt like a feast. The smell was awful, but he hoped it would taste better after grilling it with some vegetables. Chris cooked the rotten meat with rosemary, then bravely took a bite. It was the worst meat he had ever eaten, but in his situation, it was the best meal he had in a long time. For the first time in days, his stomach felt full. The forest itself was not dangerous, but finding food was hard since no living creatures were nearby. He didn't know if it was because of the herbs, but the wound on Chris's foot had almost completely healed. Another day passed for Chris. He listened for animals or monsters, but only heard birds chirping. However, today felt different. He heard rustling nearby. Turning toward the sound, he found traces on the grass and a few footprints. A faint scent of beasts lingered in the air. Sensing something close, he quickly hid behind a tree. In the distance, he spotted a two-legged creature. Looking closer, he realized it was an orc. The massive monster stood tall, gripping a wooden club. Chris quietly watched the orc walk away, thinking it was on patrol. He remembered seeing orcs before. Even his proud father found them difficult to deal with unless he used his skills. If this orc was the same as the one his father had faced, it should be just as strong as Chris. Without skills, his father's strength wasn't much better than his own. Right now, Chris only had a makeshift stone axe, and using it to fight could be risky. Still, he was hungry for meat and decided to chase after the orc. He jumped over its head, trying to strike it. To his surprise, the orc noticed him and dodged. Chris missed his chance and broke into a cold sweat. The orc stared at him, locking eyes, and Chris quickly prepared himself for a fight. The orc swung its wooden club at him, but it only hit the ground. The orc began searching for Chris, who was hiding behind a tree. Chris felt relieved that the orc didn't run away. The orc soon found Chris and smashed the tree where he was hiding. Chris jumped around like an annoying rat, darting from tree to tree. The orc tried to find him, but Chris kept moving quickly like a ninja. The orc struck another tree, but its club got stuck in the trunk. Chris saw this as his chance. He quickly ran to the other side of the tree and hit the orc's back with his stone axe. But the weapon broke easily and snapped. In a panic, Chris quickly stepped back to get some distance. Luckily, the orc was knocked out and hit the ground with a loud thud. Seeing the orc fall flat on its face, Chris wondered if he had defeated it with just one hit. The orc was still alive though, and started mumbling something. Chris realized that the wound he made was deep enough to keep the orc from moving. With no plan in mind, he used the broken handle of his axe to stab the orc in the head, ending its life. Chris looked at the blood pooling around the body. He was thankful for his toxic resistance because it allowed him to eat even rotten meat. Still, since he had taken the orc's life, he promised to make something good out of it. Chris then stabbed the orc again to make it bleed more. If there had been a source of water, he could have done a better job, but he had no choice. He knew it would be a hassle to disassemble the body now, so he decided to bring the whole thing back to his base. He carried the large dead orc in his bag, but it wasn't as heavy as he expected. As night settled over the forest, Chris finished cutting up the orc. It was large, so it took him a long time to break it into pieces. But in the end, he had a lot of meat to show for his hard work. It was a tiring day, but it felt worth it. He set aside what he needed for the day and went to tie up the rest to dry. He wanted to eat fresh meat right away, but he was covered in orc blood. He didn't want to make the muddy puddle any worse, but he had no choice. As Chris cooked the meat, he remembered that orcs were humanoid monsters and it was considered taboo to eat their meat. But in this situation, he didn't care. The smell was strong, but it wasn't like the usual rotten meat. This was the scent of fresh meat. Chris was only concerned about the taste, but he bravely took a bite. As he chewed, he realized how delicious it was. The meat was juicy and the flavor filled his mouth, reaching all the way to his brain. It was incredibly tasty and could easily be called an excellent dish. After the meal, Chris felt full and realized he had eaten the meat he had saved for the next day. He had planned to try different ways of cooking it, but now he didn't care. As he lay down, he remembered the fight with the orc, where it had dodged his surprise attack. He also noticed how thick the orc's hair and skin were. He knew this all too well since he had taken one apart himself. Inside the orc's thick body, there was a muscle that acted like armor. Until now, he couldn't hurt an orc badly with just one strike. But with a simple wooden stick, he had crushed its head and even carried the body back home without much trouble. He wondered if his strength came from the ritual's blessing. Even though his profession was farmer, the ability boost made him stronger. Still, it felt like he had become too strong. He wondered if it was because he had been defeated by Klaus that he grew stronger. The same idea applied to muscles. When they break, the body repairs them and makes them stronger. Maybe that's what had happened to him. But if that was the reason, it felt strange that he was getting stronger so suddenly. Regardless of the cause, it was a good thing, because he had been able to defeat the orc by himself. Chris's life in the forest continued. He made a bed to sleep on, trained his sword skills every day, and cooked the orc meat in different ways. He also spent time searching for food and watching the sunset. All of this happened in his small cave surrounded by nature. One day, Chris marked the walls of his cave and realized he had been in the forest for a month. He had also finished all the orc meat. In the past, Chris would have thrown away any leftover meat, but now he understood how hard it was to have no food. Even though the orc was a monster, he had killed it for its meat and he couldn't waste it. He buried the orc's bones and said a prayer of thanks. Though Chris could survive in the forest for a few more months, eating the last of the orc meat made him realize it would be harder to keep going with only the poor plants around him. He thought everyone outside had probably calmed down by now, so he saw this as his chance to leave the forest and find a city. His goal was simple, to survive and get stronger. He promised himself he would surprise both his proud father and his cruel twin brother. A little later, Chris returned to a familiar stream and drank clean water for the first time in months. He was happy to find his way back to the lake. Before this, he had only been drinking rainwater or muddy water. When he finally drank the clean water, it brought tears to his eyes. After his bath, Chris realized he couldn't leave the forest in his torn noble clothes. For now, he decided to tie his leather bag, made from the orc's skin, around his waist. It was better than being seen as an exhibitionist. Chris traveled through the forest for days until he finally reached a city. He arrived in Exiled, a busy and prosperous city near the royal capital, Meldrake. It was far from his hometown, which made it a good place to hide. He also knew that Klaus, who had received the holy sword, was probably being summoned to the royal capital. Exiled was closer to the capital, so Chris could keep an eye on Klaus while staying safe. He decided to use the city as his base. However, Chris could feel everyone's eyes on him. His clothes stood out, just as he expected. He was thankful that the city's entrance inspection was routine. It would have been a disaster if the guards had searched him thoroughly. He was allowed in since he didn't have any weapons. After getting a few coins, Chris realized he needed to spend them on clothes, food, and a place to stay. Looking at his finances, he knew he needed to find a way to make more money. Chris went to a prop shop called Goldborn. A man greeted him and led him to the appraiser's room. Chris knew it was a big company, so he thought he wouldn't get scammed. He had brought some items from his house that he wanted to sell before leaving. The appraiser greeted Chris but then looked him over from head to toe. The appraiser seemed disgusted and asked Chris to leave. Chris heard the appraiser then scolding an employee for letting someone in who clearly didn't have anything valuable. At first, Chris thought he had picked the wrong shop, but then he realized it made sense that it would be hard to trust someone wearing ragged clothes. What Chris didn't know was that someone shady was watching him from the shadows. Soon Chris found himself walking through the slums, surprised that he was still in the same city. The shops in the city clearly showed what they sold, but the tents in the slums didn't give any clues at all. He felt it would be rude to peek inside the tents and complained that the people in the slums didn't even put up signs. The hooded kid who had been following Chris earlier suddenly tugged on his clothes. Chris asked if the kid had gotten lost. Without answering, the kid threw something at Chris. A strange liquid came out and covered his eyes, catching him completely off guard. Chris asked what the kid was doing, but the kid ran away without saying anything. In that moment, the kid also grabbed Chris's bag. Chris panicked. His stuff was stolen. He quickly opened his water bottle and splashed his face to wash off the strange liquid. Then he ran through the busy street and spotted the kid in the crowd. To his surprise, the kid easily moved through the sea of people without bumping into anyone. Chris noticed how good the kid was at running through crowds and guessed she was used to it. But that didn't matter when it came to someone like Chris. He quickly caught up to the kid and picked her up like a stray cat. He warned her not to take advantage of people's kindness. The kid was surprised and started to throw a tantrum, demanding Chris let her go. Chris warned her to stop shouting or he would punch her. Chris removed the hood from the girl and realized she wasn't a child, but someone around his own age. When he saw her crying and kneeling, it looked like he was the one who had done something wrong to her. He asked why she had stolen his things. The girl didn't answer and covered her mouth with her hands. Chris asked why she was covering her mouth. She said she would get beaten if she told him the reason. Chris said he would still beat her up no matter what. She then claimed there was no real reason for stealing, but if she had to come up with one, it was just to survive. She said that was why she became a thief. Chris wondered why she didn't target wealthier people instead of him. He started to think she might be lying. From her skills, Chris guessed that this wasn't the first time she had stolen, but the girl didn't comment on it. He asked if she had parents, but the girl said she had only weapons. Chris then asked if she had any accomplices. The girl panicked and hesitated at first. After thinking for a moment, she said she didn't have any accomplices, trembling. To Chris, she seemed like a terrible liar. Chris decided to take the girl to the soldiers, but she begged him not to. He told her to stop lying and just tell the truth. He mentioned that he wasn't going to report her to the authorities because he didn't want to deal with them. The girl then explained that her partners were the people living in an abandoned building. When Chris asked how many there were, she said just 2. He also asked if the other person was a thief too, and the girl confirmed it. Based on her reaction, Chris believed she was telling the truth this time. He held her head and asked where her accomplice was. He promised that she would be safe if she helped him find them. Meanwhile, a boy sat in the corner of a rundown house wondering what happened to his partner. She was late, and he feared she had been caught. His worry was correct. The girl had indeed been caught and was now in the house. The boy cursed and grabbed his sword. When Chris saw the boy preparing his weapon, he said he wouldn't hold back if the boy attacked. The girl told the boy, named Ralph, to drop his weapon. Ralph was confused. Since the girl had already been caught, he asked why she brought her captor with her. The girl explained that she would have been hurt if she didn't bring Chris along. Chris took a quick look at Ralph and realized that the boy knew some martial arts and sword techniques. However, his balance was poor, and Chris knew that even if Ralph tried, he wouldn't be able to defeat him. Ralph asked what Chris wanted, and said they had no money to give. Chris already knew that and said he only came to warn them. He told them not to touch his things, or he wouldn't go easy on them. The two were confused and asked if that was all. Chris let go of the girl and agreed that just warning them seemed a bit pointless. He then said he wouldn't ask for money, but instead he wanted information. He admitted that he had just arrived in the city and didn't know his way around. He wanted to know the way back to the central area. Ralph said it wouldn't be a problem if that was all Chris needed. Chris then asked the girl if she agreed, since she was the one directly involved. What Chris really needed was information about the city, which he didn't know. He then tried to ask for their names, but the two said they wouldn't tell him. Chris already knew their names, though, because they had been shouting them earlier. Ralph was shocked and said he had no interest in being friends. Chris understood. Ralph and Hesta guided Chris around the city and took him to different stores. Afterward, Chris thanked them. Ralph mentioned that the store owners were not happy about their visits, but Chris still wanted to thank them. Ralph and Hesta tried to leave, but Chris stopped them. He said he wanted them to show him the most important place they knew. He asked where they were selling the items they had stolen so far. Ralph said it was at an acquaintance's pawn shop. Chris agreed that those shops buy stolen goods and asked why Ralph was telling him this. Chris then told them to just lead the way. The two were cautious, but Chris reassured them that he meant no harm. He admitted that he only wanted to sell some stolen goods. Ralph was shocked, realizing Chris was also a thief, and scolded him for stealing. Chris explained he only did it once, and it was with his father's belongings. Ralph didn't care who it was from. Stealing was stealing, and it was no different from what they were doing. Chris reminded them that he would ignore the disrespect they showed him if they helped him out. He also said that he only warned them not to steal from him and didn't care if they stole from others. Ralph then asked if Chris would really not report them to the authorities. Chris promised that he wouldn't, as long as they guided him. After thinking it over, the two thieves decided to take Chris to their last stop on the tour. The three of them went to the pawn shop, and the owner was surprised to see Ralph and Hesta bringing someone new. The old man stared at Chris and asked what was happening. Ralph explained that Chris was someone they had just met and wanted to sell something. He asked the old man if he could buy it. The old man wasn't sure about dealing with a stranger but agreed anyway. He asked for Chris's name, and Chris answered right away. The old man shook his hand and said Chris had a nice name. He introduced himself as Rugans. Chris placed his father's belongings on the table, and Rugans commented on how valuable everything seemed. He asked Chris to look around the shop while he appraised each item carefully. Chris looked at the swords, which were worth 5 gold coins. They looked great, but he didn't have enough money to afford them. Next, he checked the bookshelves and found a book he had never seen before called The Memoirs of Botanist Otto. The book didn't seem interesting, but Chris found himself drawn to it. He wanted to buy it if it was cheap, but it turned out to be worth 3 gold coins. It was an old, rare book, but the price was too high. Chris thought there must be something special about it. Hesta sneaked up behind him and asked if Chris could really read the characters in the book. Chris said he had been taught to read since he was little and asked if Hesta couldn't read. Hesta struggled to respond and then said it was nothing, which confused Chris. Rugans returned and said he had finished the appraisal. He said he would buy everything if Chris was okay with the prices. The earrings were priced at 2 silver coins and the ring was worth 4 silver coins. Surprisingly, the necklace was worth 3 gold coins, which shocked Chris. Rugans explained that the necklace had a small sapphire attached to it, making it valuable. Ralph was surprised, especially since he knew how careful Rugans was with money. He thought Chris must be from a rich family. Rugans told him not to interfere with his business. Finally, Rugans offered 1 gold coin for the pocket watch. Chris was shocked to learn that the pocket watch his father had treasured wasn't worth much. He stayed quiet for a moment, then decided to sell everything except the pocket watch. Chris thanked the old man for his help. Rugans explained that he had to lower the price because the items were stolen. He mentioned that he was also benefiting from the deal and told Chris not to worry. Then he asked if Chris needed anything else. Chris said there was one thing. He showed Rugans a book he had found earlier. Rugans was surprised because no one else had paid attention to it. He said he found the book interesting too because its content was fascinating. That's why he had set the price for it, but it had been years since he last looked at it. Because of the price, Chris thought the author must have been someone successful. Rugans laughed and said the author wasn't famous or accomplished. However, if a knowledgeable person read it, they might see the book as a masterpiece. That was his opinion, at least. Chris admitted that he had also become interested in the book. However, he didn't have enough money to buy it right then and asked Rugans if he could reserve it to purchase later. The old man told him he could pay later and just return to the shop when he had the money. Chris was confused, especially because Rugans's serious eyes made him uncomfortable. He asked if he could really do that, feeling awkward since he had just sold stolen goods. Rugans assured him not to worry, saying that not many people would offer such a deal. He explained that the book hadn't been sold in years, and if Chris took it without paying, he wouldn't be bothered. Rugans didn't care when Chris paid, but when he did, it would mean he finally sold the book that had been unsellable for so long. If Chris didn't pay, Rugans would just get the money from Ralph. Ralph, who had been listening, complained about it. Rugans then asked if Chris would take the book, and since the old man was offering, Chris agreed to buy it. Ralph tried to stop him, saying he would never pay, but Rugans just laughed. Afterward, Chris thanked Ralph and Hesta for helping him earn more money than he expected. Ralph mentioned that it was the same amount someone would usually make in a month. Chris then offered to treat them to some food, and Hesta's face lit up with excitement. Ralph called her a fool and reminded her that they hadn't stolen anything yet that day. Hesta argued that it was better to accept a free meal than to keep searching for things to sell. Ralph somewhat agreed, but he found it strange that Chris wanted to buy food for the very people who had tried to steal from him earlier. Chris explained that he was just thanking them for leading him to a good place. Hesta urged Ralph to accept the offer since they had no money anyway. Even though Chris didn't have much, after spending the past month living in the forest, he found it nice to have someone to talk to, even if they were thieves. The three of them went to a tavern and chatted while waiting for their food. When the food arrived, the two thieves were surprised to see Chris eating without holding back. Ralph joked that they had ordered the same meal, but Chris made his look more delicious. Chris explained that he had spent the past month eating nothing but orc meat without any seasoning. Disgusted, Ralph immediately told him not to mention orc meat again. Ralph was amazed to learn that Chris had survived in the forest with nothing. Chris explained that in the first few days he ate almost anything he could find and even drank muddy water. Ralph couldn't believe it and pointed out that poisonous plants could have been deadly. Chris said there was nothing to worry about because he had a skill called toxic resistance. Ralph was shocked that Chris mentioned his skill so casually in public. However, Chris didn't care since he thought it was a weak skill that didn't change anything. Ralph commented on how carefree Chris was, but warned him that not all poisons were harmless. He knew some people with the same skill, and they still had to be careful. Chris guessed that those people probably just had less stomach pain or fewer side effects, but Ralph wasn't sure, as he had noticed they were only slightly better at drinking alcohol than others. Chris then said he ate anything that looked suspicious, yet nothing ever happened to him. At that moment, Hester realized why her aloe ball had no effect on Chris. Chris asked if she was talking about the red thing she threw straight into his eyes. Ralph was stunned because aloe balls contained a strong anesthetic, and Chris should not have been able to move for an entire day. Chris was shocked they were using something so dangerous. Since the aloe ball had no effect on him, Ralph guessed that Chris's toxic resistance had somehow turned into toxic nullification. Still, he warned that it wasn't something Chris should rely on too much. After the meal, Ralph asked Chris about his plans. Chris said he would become an adventurer for now since he knew some sword skills and needed money to survive. Ralph then mentioned that wanderers usually ended up as either adventurers or criminals. Chris asked if they had any plans for their future or if they planned to live by stealing forever. The two stayed silent for a moment before Ralph finally said that was his plan. Since they weren't strong enough to be adventurers, they had no choice but to dirty their hands. Chris thought that was a harsh thing to say, but he reminded them that if someone else had caught them instead of him, they could have been thrown in prison. He suggested they find a better way to live. The scene then shifted to the Adventurers Guild, where many people were going in and out. A beautiful receptionist greeted Chris and told him the registration fee was 1 silver coin. Without hesitation, Chris placed a silver coin on the desk. The receptionist explained that his personal information would be recorded using magic, then asked for his name and age. Chris introduced himself without his last name and said he was 26 years old. A magic crystal between them glowed, and the receptionist handed Chris his identification card, marking the completion of his registration. She explained that he could now accept quests and trade within the guild. His ID would keep track of his quest records, rank, and could also be used as a general form of identification. As the receptionist handed over the ID, she asked if Chris had any more questions. Chris wanted to know if he could take any quest he wanted. The receptionist advised him to start with beginner-level quests. The more quests he completed, the higher his adventurer rank would become. As his rank increased, he could take on more difficult quests. Chris then asked about the ranks the receptionist had mentioned. She explained that the ranks started at rookie level, followed by bronze, silver, gold, platinum, mithril, diamond, orichalcum, and finally scarletite. However, the last two ranks were extremely rare, so Chris didn't need to worry about them for now. Chris asked about the skills needed for each rank. The receptionist explained that it mostly depended on the right abilities and professions. It also relied on the number of completed quests and success rates, making it hard to give a definite answer. She mentioned that rookies started with a stat of 10, bronze ranks had 20, and the numbers kept doubling for each higher rank. Chris thanked her for the explanation and continued asking more questions. The receptionist answered all of Chris's questions professionally, but after a while she became tired from talking. She asked if he had any more questions, and Chris said he was satisfied, though she doubted it. Still, she wished him luck with his adventuring. Without resting, Chris picked up a quest to exterminate goblins. The reward was 2 copper coins per goblin, and he had to bring back their left ears as proof. He remembered how badly he failed his surprise attack against the orc before, but this time, he was determined to strike accurately. Chris sneaked up behind a goblin without being noticed. He locked his eyes on it and swung his sword. With a single slash, he cut the goblin in half. The creature collapsed, lifeless, in a pool of its own blood. However, Chris felt something strange. When he fought the orc before, the experience had been completely different. Even with a proper sword, slicing through a goblin so easily felt unreal. He didn't understand why, but he had a feeling he had gained some kind of extraordinary power.